In 1948, a journalist named Albert Deutsch walked through the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. He had covered wars. He had witnessed poverty and disease across America. He had reported from some of the most desperate places on earth. But nothing in his career prepared him for what he found inside those walls. When he published his findings in a book called The Shame of the States, Deutsch wrote that Byberry reminded him of photographs from the Nazi concentration camps at Belsen and Buchenwald. This was not hyperbole. This was not a metaphor designed for dramatic effect. An American journalist, walking through an American hospital in an American city in the state of Pennsylvania, looked around at what he saw and compared it to the Holocaust. He described naked bodies pressed together in rooms built for half as many people. Patients lying in their own waste because no one came to clean them for days at a time. The stench of human decay was so thick it seemed to have physical weight, clinging to his clothes and skin long after he left. Men huddled along walls like cattle, staring at nothing, waiting for nothing. And this hospital would continue operating for another 42 years after Deutsch wrote those words. Byberry wasn't some forgotten asylum hidden in the countryside where no one could see it. It sat on Roosevelt Boulevard in northeast Philadelphia, one of the busiest roads in Pennsylvania, US Route 1. Thousands of cars drove past its gates every single day. The buildings were visible from the highway. For 80 years, an atrocity operated in plain sight of a major American city. But here's what makes this story different from other asylum scandals. Byberry was exposed in 1946. Life magazine published photographs that shocked the nation. Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, personally intervened. Congressional hearings were held, state investigations launched, reforms were promised by politicians who expressed horror at what they learned, and nothing changed. The abuse continued. The deaths mounted. Patients were murdered by staff and by each other. Bodies were discovered on the grounds, some missing for months before anyone noticed they were gone. By the time Byberry finally closed in 1990, it had become something far worse than what that journalist witnessed in 1948. To understand how an American hospital became a concentration camp, you have to go back to when it was built with the best of intentions. In 1906, Philadelphia had a crisis. The city's psychiatric facilities at Blockley Arms House were overflowing beyond capacity. Patients were being housed in basements and hallways. Families had nowhere to send relatives who could not care for themselves. Something had to be done. The city purchased over 800 acres of farmland in northeast Philadelphia, near the border with Bucks County, and began construction on what they called Byberry City Farms. The concept was considered revolutionary for its time. Mental illness was not a curse or a punishment. It was a disease that could be treated with the right environment. Patients would live in cottage-style buildings surrounded by nature. They would tend gardens and raise livestock. They would breathe fresh air and feel sunlight on their skin. Through honest labor and humane conditions, their minds would slowly heal. The first buildings opened in 1907. Architects designed wide windows to let in maximum sunlight. The campus eventually grew to include over 50 buildings, a working farm, a power plant that generated electricity for the entire facility, a chapel, recreation facilities, and acres of landscaped grounds. From the main road, Byberry looked more like a college campus than a hospital. It looked like hope. The philosophy behind Byberry followed the theories of Benjamin Rush, often called the father of American psychiatry. Rush believed mental illness was a medical condition, not a moral failing. Patients were not criminals to be locked away and forgotten. They were sick people who deserved treatment and compassion and the chance to recover. That was the promise Byberry made to Philadelphia. But within a decade, that promise had begun to rot from the inside. By 1914, Byberry held over 2,200 patients, already straining its capacity. By 1934, that number had exploded to 4,500 people, crammed into facilities designed for 2,500. A national survey that year documented the crisis, but nothing was done. By 1947, the patient population reached 6,100. At its peak in 1960, Byberry housed over 7,000 human beings. The staffing situation made everything worse. There was one attendant for every 400 patients. Think about that number for a moment. One person responsible for 400 mentally ill patients. Some were violent and unpredictable. Some were catatonic and needed help with every basic function. Some were actively suicidal and required constant supervision. Imagine a single person trying to care for 400 people. The math made proper care mathematically impossible. Patients slept on floors and in hallways because there were not enough beds. They wandered the corridors naked because there was not enough clothing to go around. The bathrooms overflowed. The smell of human waste permeated every building, every ward, every corner of the campus that had been designed to heal through fresh air and sunlight. Staff who genuinely wanted to help found themselves overwhelmed, outnumbered, and eventually broken by the hopelessness of the situation. They could not provide adequate care. They could barely maintain basic survival. And those who did not want to help found something far worse. They found vulnerable people with no voice, no advocates, no families who visited, and no way to escape or tell anyone what was happening to them. They found perfect victims. And then something unexpected happened. The people who would eventually expose Byberry were not journalists or doctors. They were men who refused to fight in a war. During World War II, over 40,000 Americans registered as conscientious objectors. These were Quakers, Mennonites, members of the Church of the Brethren, and others whose religious beliefs prohibited them from taking human life. They wanted to serve their country, but not with weapons. The government assigned roughly 3,000 of these men to work in state mental hospitals across America. It was supposed to be punishment. A way to make pacifists do the dirty work that nobody else wanted to do. Instead, it became a catalyst for change. In 1942, a young Quaker named Warren Sawyer reported for duty at Byberry. He was 23 years old. When he took the bus to the hospital, other passengers recognized where he was going. They called him a yellow belly, a coward, a slacker. What he found inside Byberry was worse than anything he could have imagined. Sawyer and the other conscientious objectors witnessed patients beaten by staff. They saw men lying in their own filth for days because no one would clean them. They watched people receive medical procedures without anesthesia because doctors believed the mentally ill did not feel pain the same way normal people did. One of those conscientious objectors was a man named Charlie Lord. Before the war, Lord had borrowed a camera to take on his honeymoon. He dropped it in a lake and felt obligated to buy the damaged camera from his friend. That camera would change American history. Lord smuggled the camera into Byberry in his jacket pocket. He could not look through the viewfinder because someone might notice. Instead, he learned to shoot from the hip, getting as close to his subjects as possible to fill the frame. He photographed naked men huddled along walls. He photographed patients strapped to beds with leather restraints. He photographed the decay and the neglect and the hopelessness. One of the first people to see these photographs was the most powerful woman in America. In September 1945, just 4 months after the war in Europe ended, a meeting was arranged between Eleanor Roosevelt and several conscientious objectors from Byberry. President Franklin Roosevelt had died just months earlier. Eleanor was no longer First Lady, but she remained one of the most influential voices in American politics. The men brought Charlie Lord's photographs. Roosevelt's initial reaction tells you everything you need to know about America's blind spot for its own atrocities. She looked at photographs of naked men huddled against walls, of patients restrained to beds in rooms covered with filth, of conditions that looked like something from a nightmare. And she assumed they must be from somewhere in the South, Mississippi maybe, Alabama. She knew about conditions like that in those backwoods places. When the conscientious objectors told her the photographs came from Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania, one of the most developed regions of the most powerful nation on earth, Eleanor Roosevelt was stunned into silence. She promised to support the reform campaign. She wrote letters to government health officials demanding action. She contacted journalists and urged them to investigate. The photographs appeared in Life magazine on May 6, 1946. The issue was read by millions. The article was titled, "Bedlam 1946, Most United States Mental Hospitals Are a Shame and a Disgrace." Albert Maisel, the reporter who wrote it, compared the conditions to concentration camps, echoing what Albert Deutsch would write 2 years later. America was horrified. Editorials were written. Politicians expressed outrage. Families demanded to know if their loved ones were being treated this way. And then, nothing changed. Byberry was renamed Philadelphia State Hospital. New buildings were constructed during the 1940s and 1950s with modern amenities. Investigations were conducted by state officials. Reports were written documenting problems and recommending solutions. And every few years, another scandal would surface, another journalist would document the horrors, and another round of reforms would be promised by politicians who seemed genuinely disturbed by what they learned. For 40 more years, Byberry continued operating exactly as it had before. The death count mounted steadily, invisibly. In the 1950s, at least 10 patients died directly from neglect. Between 1960 and 1970, another 10 died the same way. These were not accidents. These were not natural causes. These were people who starved because no one fed them. They froze because no one noticed they had wandered outside. They developed infections from bed sores that went untreated for weeks. A necrology compiled by the Philadelphia Inquirer documented dozens of violent deaths and suicides. In 1951, 4 female patients were killed when another patient set fire to their ward. 2 orderlies were convicted of manslaughter after choking a patient to death. One of them, a former prizefighter, became known as the Slugger of Byberry. He was convicted and later hired back at higher pay because officials believed he had post-traumatic stress disorder from the war. Staff developed creative methods of torture that left no visible marks on the body. One technique, documented in the Philadelphia Record newspaper, was called the water cure. An attendant would soak a large towel in water. He would wring it out and wrap it around a patient's neck. Then he would slowly twist. First, he tightened the noose. Then he gave the towel a slow turn to let the patient know what was in store for them. The twisting continued. The patient's eyes bulged. Their tongue swelled. Their breathing became labored. Eventually, their body went limp. Their face turned a dreadful white. They appeared to stop breathing entirely. 15 minutes would pass before they showed signs of returning to life. The patient was then considered subdued. Patients beat other patients with impunity. The hospital housed violent criminals who had been sent for psychiatric evaluation instead of serving prison time. One patient attempted murder with a sharpened spoon in 1944, driving the improvised weapon an inch into another patient's neck, just barely missing the jugular vein. If you're finding this history important, consider subscribing. We're documenting these forgotten chapters of institutional abuse because the people who suffered deserve to be remembered. But the worst was yet to come. In 1987, a patient named Charles Gable murdered a female patient. He did not just kill her. He dismembered her body and scattered the pieces across the grounds. Staff only discovered what had happened when other patients were found carrying her teeth around the facility. Her mandible, her teeth, in the pockets and hands of other residents who had found them like toys on a playground. That same year, investigators found 2 more bodies on the property. One patient had been missing for nearly 5 months. No one had noticed. No one had looked. They simply vanished into the overgrown grounds of a facility that had stopped pretending to care about the people it was supposed to protect. The woman who finally brought down Byberry wasn't a journalist or a politician. She was a patient. Anna Jennings arrived at Byberry in 1984. She was 24 years old, with a history of childhood sexual abuse that had led to depression, anger, and eventually institutionalization. At Byberry, she was subjected to forced medication, seclusion, restraints, hair pulling, and physical violence. But Anna Jennings did something that no other patient had managed to do. She documented everything. She wrote notes about what she witnessed, the abuse, the neglect, the patients left in restraints for days at a time. One man, William Kirsch, was kept in 4-point restraints for more than a year, possibly as long as 3 years. His attorney later said he was much better when he went in there 7 or 8 years ago. Anna smuggled her notes to her mother, and her mother happened to work in state mental health oversight. The notes triggered an investigation. A blue ribbon committee was formed. They toured the facility and found conditions they described as atrocious and irreversible. 5 top officials were fired. On December 7, 1987, a press conference announced that Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry would close. It took 3 more years. Patient advocates fought to ensure that those being released would have somewhere to go. Former patients filed lawsuits. The settlement guaranteed funding for community services. On June 21, 1990, Byberry closed its doors forever. But the story doesn't end there. The buildings sat abandoned. Over 50 structures spread across hundreds of acres, slowly rotting in northeast Philadelphia. The city could not afford to demolish them. Asbestos lined the walls. Lead paint peeled from every surface. Looters came first, stripping copper pipes and wiring. Then vandals smashed windows and set fires. Then urban explorers arrived, drawn by the legends that began spreading across the early internet. Miles of underground tunnels connected the buildings, originally built to transport patients between wards without exposing them to the outside world. Now, those tunnels became the subject of darker stories. Local teenagers spoke of satanic rituals held on the grounds. Dead animals were found in the buildings. Police became frequent visitors, chasing off trespassers who came looking for ghosts. One urban legend persisted longer than the others. People said a former patient still lived in those tunnels. He carried a large knife. He chased anyone who ventured too deep into the darkness. Was it a ghost? Was it a real person who had never left? No one wanted to find out. In 2006, the last buildings were finally demolished. Today, the site is occupied by a retirement community called the Arbors at Eagle Point. Seniors live in comfortable homes built on the same ground where thousands suffered for 80 years. There is no memorial, no marker explaining what happened there, no monument to the patients who died, many of them in unmarked graves that were never properly documented. The question Byberry leaves us with is not really about the past, it is about how we respond to suffering when it is hidden from view. How did an American institution compared to Nazi concentration camps by multiple journalists continue operating for another 42 years after being exposed? How did photographs that shocked Eleanor Roosevelt fail to force real change? How did congressional hearings and state investigations and newspaper exposés all lead to exactly nothing? The answer is uncomfortable. America knew about Byberry. America saw the photographs in Life magazine. America read the articles and watched the news reports. America held the hearings and promised the reforms and expressed appropriate horror at appropriate moments. And America chose to look away. The mentally ill were invisible people. Their suffering happened behind walls that most citizens never had to see. They had no voting power, no economic influence, no celebrities championing their cause. And as long as the problem was contained, as long as the screaming could not be heard from Roosevelt Boulevard, as long as the photographs stayed in magazines that could be closed and forgotten, it was easier to keep driving past. When Anna Jennings smuggled those notes to her mother, she did what Charlie Lord had done 40 years earlier with his honeymoon camera. She made the invisible visible. She refused to let the suffering stay hidden behind institutional walls. Anna Jennings died by suicide 6 years after leaving Byberry at a different psychiatric institution. She was 32 years old, but her legacy endures in ways she never got to see. The lawsuit settlement she helped trigger funded the community services that allowed former patients to live independently for the first time in their lives. A study conducted by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania found that 6 years after Byberry's closure, those former patients were thriving in community settings. They were not on the streets. They were not dead. They were living lives that Byberry had told them they could never have. The building is gone now. The tunnels are filled in. The ghosts, if they exist, have nowhere left to haunt. But if we forget what happened at Byberry, we forget the lesson it taught us. That atrocities do not require evil masterminds or deliberate cruelty. They require only indifference, only the decision made 1,000 times by 1,000 ordinary people to look away from suffering that does not affect them directly. Byberry operated for 80 years in plain sight of Philadelphia because enough people decided it was not their problem. The question is whether we have learned anything at all. If this documentary meant something to you, please take a moment to subscribe and share it with others. These stories matter because the people who lived them matter. We are committed to making sure they are never forgotten.